Good evening and welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. Tonight, we delve into a topic of utmost importance, the influence of money in politics. At the Network for Responsible Public Policy, our mission is to bring timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement. Tonight's program is a clear demonstration of our commitment to this mission. We have one of the foremost experts on the influence of money in government. Professor Lawrence Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law. Before returning to Harvard, he taught at Stanford Law, where he founded the Center for Internet and Society. He also taught at the University of Chicago. Professor Lessig clerked for Judge Richard Posner on the Seventh Circuit of Appeals and Justice Antonin Scalia on the United States Supreme Court. Professor Lessig's complete biography, including his many honorary degrees, his extensive writings and recognitions, and his is detailed on our website, nfrpp.org. We are again pleased to share that tonight's program is the second in a series of 3 supported by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State University. The McCourtney Institute defends the rights everyone has as a democratic citizen, from voting to protesting to consuming information, from a free press that serves as a check on our political leaders. We are pleased to partner with the McCourtney Institute to bring tonight's important discussion to our growing audience. We will respond to as many questions as time allows. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. The questions pop up on our screens, so don't worry if you don't see your question on your screen. Today, we are witnessing the profound impact of money in politics, unfolding in real time in Washington, D.C. It is clearly a serious threat to our democracy. How does this happen, and what can citizens do about it? Professor Lessig, welcome back to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and I'm really happy to be back. I remember fondly actually being physically with you, and it's great to be able to be there virtually. I want to start with a story, and it's a story that leads to, I think, a terrifying picture, but I'm not going to leave you terrified. I'm going to leave you hopeful. Because however bad things might seem right now, I actually believe that they are teeing up the greatest opportunity we've had to address the corrupting influence of money in American politics and the failure of American government to convince most Americans that it's working for them. So the story goes like this. Imagine you're on the Titanic and you're the captain, and the ship hits the iceberg. And when it hits the iceberg, it's not terribly noticeable. So the captain walks out and looks at the deck, and maybe there's some fragments of ice that's across the deck. Maybe some tables have been overturned. And so he thinks to himself, well, we can fix this. And he has the crew begin to clean up the mess caused by the iceberg. And then his engineer comes to him and tells him there's a gash in the hull and 6 of the compartments are filling with water. And the captain recognizes it doesn't matter if they fix the overturned tables, the ship is going down. And then he recognizes the need to convince people to get into lifeboats. And in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the Atlantic, on the Titanic, it's not an easy thing to convince people that they need to get into lifeboats because the Titanic is unsinkable. And no one can imagine that there's a reason to have to abandon an unsinkable ship. Now, I mean that story to be a little bit of a metaphor for where we are in American democracy. For 18 years now, it's a little hard for me to accept this fact, but for 18 years now, I've been engaged with many, obviously, in the fight to reform our democracy, to end what I think of as its core corruption, which is the corrupting influence of money in politics. I was turned on to this work by an incredible young man, a kid named Aaron Swartz, who in 2007 said to me, as he was visiting me and I was completing my last book I would write on copyright policy and the internet, Aaron said to me, "Why do you think you're going to solve any of the problems you're talking about or make any change in the field of copyright so long as we have this deeply corrupted political system?" And I said to him, Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, "You mean as an academic?" And I said, "Yeah, as an academic, it's not my field. I work on copyright policy and technology policy." And he said, "Okay, but what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen?" And when he said that, I realized he had me trapped. And literally that night, I promised him I would give up my work on internet and copyright policy and take up this fight to address this corruption. And that's what I've been doing for 18 years. And in that time, many have come to recognize the changes we would need to make our unrepresentative representative democracy representative again. And the core of those changes is to address the money in politics problem, and we know what to do with that. And then there's the gerrymandering problem, and we know what to do with that too. And the vote suppression issues, we know what to do with that. Indeed, we know what to do, and we came very close with John Sarbanes' For the People Act, a version of which almost passed in the Senate, came within 2 votes of passing in the Senate, and would have been the most important democracy reform legislation America would have passed since the Civil War. We came incredibly close. And it's clear that if we were to be in a position that we could pass that bill, we could get those reforms done. Now, the thing about those reforms is they're the equivalent, in the story I told, of the overturned tables and the ice on the deck of the Titanic. Because it's something we could do, it's clear how we would do it, and it's something that would accomplish an important change. But there's a gash in the hull of this democracy, that even if we fixed all of these problems of democracy, is still profoundly destructive of our representative system. And that gash in the hull is a media ecosystem that is driven by AI-driven social media. And the reason that's a gash in the hull is that we are seeing the consequences of social media and the business model of engagement that goes with social media. Because what social media is not a technology. It's just a business model. The business model is a model deployed by Facebook, by X, by Instagram, by TikTok. That business model is driven to try to get people to engage with the platform. They are constantly driving to make sure you spend every second you've got focused on this platform. And obviously, for some generations, it's extremely successful. It constantly pulls you in and addicts you to the content that it's feeding you. Now, in order to do that, in order to succeed in convincing you that you need to spend all of your time on these devices as opposed to with your family or with your friends, it needs to feed you content that keeps you engaged, content that keeps you constantly eager to focus and to be engaged with other people in that platform. And what we know about that content is that it is the most destructive kind of political content that a people could be exposed to. That the way that they get you engaged is to convince you that the other side is the enemy. The way that they get all of us engaged is to turn us into ignorant people who hate each other. Not because Mark Zuckerberg hates America, not because anybody necessarily wants to destroy American democracy. They're just trying to sell ads. It's just a business model. But the consequence maybe unintended consequence of this business model is a system that drives us to consume content that turns us into people who don't know what's happening, to people who don't recognize the truth about what is going on in our world, because we each live, as Rene DeResta puts it, in our own bespoke realities. We live in these places that are different depending on which group you come from. And when you live in these bespoke realities, these separate realities, you don't see the same problems that the rest of America sees. You see them from the left, you see them from the right, you see them from the north, you see them from the university, whatever. The point is, the thing you see is not the thing everyone sees. And when you have a democracy where people don't even understand the same facts, we can't begin to address problems in a coherent and sensible way. Now, you might look at that and say, well, okay, we just should decide to use less social media. We should just decide to focus ourselves less on those devices and more on sensible, long-form engagement. Things like this type of event. And no doubt there will be people who do that. But the point is, these AI technologies are extremely good at figuring out how to pull you in. And as they figure out what they need to do to pull you back in, the consequence will be that we will continue to be driven into these polarizing and unproductively divided political environments. There's a direct analogy here if you think about processed or ultra-processed foods. I mean, obviously, there's industries, right? The processed food industry, which is in the business of selling food that they want people to consume. And there are people inside those industries. It's a fantastic book by Michael Moss called Salt, Sugar, Fat, telling the story of people inside that industry realizing that the kind of food that's going to be the most addictive to humans turns out to be food that's just not healthy for us. Turns out to be food which we can consume, and consume quite voraciously, but which is not healthy for our bodies. And the companies are not trying to make us unhealthy, they're just trying to sell food. But it just so happens, too bad for us, that the kind of food we're most attracted to, that's most addictive, the perfect mix of salt, sugar, fat, is the kind of food that's not going to make us healthy. And there are companies that have understood this, like Kraft Foods, a classic example. And for periods of time, they tried to change the way they made their processed food, try to make it into healthier food that wasn't as addictive or as bad for you if you consumed it. And what they discovered when they tried to make food that was not as bad for you, but just as attractive, is that people weren't interested. People moved away to the other companies providing the more traditional, addictive, processed food. And so that company, Kraft, and others, though they tried, gave up because they're in the business of making money. And it just turns out the money they make the most if they make the food that turns out to be bad for us. It's the same with our minds. It's the same with our brains. These AI-driven technologies have learned exactly what buttons they need to push. And the consequence of the buttons they push is that we are ignorant people who hate each other. And that reality defines where politics is today and where politics is going. Indeed, as you think about AI becoming more and more integrated into our lives, and the engagement with AI becoming more and more regular, those technologies will increasingly develop sophisticated models of everybody they're dealing with. I was speaking to a technology researcher named Asa Raskin. Asa Raskin's father was one of the original developers of the Apple computer, the Macintosh. And Asa was himself a technology designer. And his great sin was inventing the infinite scroll, the design technique so that when you're scrolling down your feed, it never ends. It's constantly being refreshed. So guilty was he for this invention that he left and co-founded with Tristan Harris, the Center for Humane Technology, which is trying to think about how do we make sure that technology helps us, not that it hurts us. And I was talking to him about these AIs because he, in this extraordinary talk he gave with Tristan, was describing 2024 as the last human election. And what he was imagining is that as these AI technologies become more and more familiar and we engage with them more and more, that they will begin to deploy these bots, and you tell me who the they is, the Russians or the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or it doesn't matter. They will deploy these bots to develop models of the people who are engaged with them. 100 million of these on the internet, engaging with people and learning how to push their buttons to get them to do what they need them to do. And then after spending 3 years coming to understand how people are and how they can be manipulated, then these bots are a tool for whomever pays the most to be used to get people to do what the bots want them to do. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're a liberal Democrat, you're going to be convinced to vote MAGA, or if you're MAGA, you're going to be convinced to vote for a liberal Democrat. But they can steer you in ways to reduce your eagerness to participate in an election or mislead you about facts that might be relevant for an election. The point is, the potential of these super intelligent agents to engage with us in a destructive way is something we've not begun to reckon. So I would say that where we are already, 2024, is bad enough, and where we are going is going to be even worse. And so that's the gash in the hull. And that means that we need to recognize that all the work that we've been doing to reform democracy is in a certain sense not going to matter if we continue to have to do politics against the background of this type of influence. So then we have to get into the lifeboats. And what are the lifeboats? Well, there are two kinds I want to talk about. One is long-term. I think the most important change that democracy is going to see. And the other is short-term, what we're going to do in the next 4 years. The long-term is a little bit dramatic, perhaps, but I think pretty obvious for anybody who's been engaged with this type of democratic reform. And one way to think about it is that we need to move democracy from the unprotected space that it is right now, where all of us are vulnerable to the manipulation of these intelligences that will engage with us to drive us to do what they want us to do, to move from that unprotected space into a protected space, into a space where we can engage in democratic deliberation without that kind of manipulation. And the most important example of this that we're seeing taking off all around the world is the explosion of what's called citizen assemblies. Now, a citizen assembly is a small, maybe 100, ideally it would be something like 300, but a small representative and randomly selected population representing a city or a state or a country, doesn't matter. And they're brought together and given information about whatever topic. And the information has been vetted by people from both sides. And once they're presented this information, they have a chance to sit with others in small groups of 6 to 8 and deliberate about the issue that they're presented with. And when they've deliberated about that issue after a long period of time, maybe a day, in some cases longer than that, then they give their views about those issues. And what you see from the beginning of those deliberations to the end of the deliberations is the maturing of the public's understanding of that view. And what we see from that output is something which represents, in an important way, the long-term, sensible, informed understanding of a public about that view. Now, there are really dramatic examples of this that are happening around the world. So, for example, after the 2008 financial crisis in Ireland, there was an extraordinary movement to try to change much about the Irish government. A lot of frustration with what happened after the financial crisis. And they set up these citizen assemblies to address some constitutional issues. And two of the issues they addressed were same-sex marriage and abortion. Now, those were two issues that the Irish people knew the Irish Parliament could not take up and address in a sensible way because the influence of the Catholic Church in the Irish Parliament was overwhelming. So they did it in these citizen assemblies. And in the citizen assemblies, after deliberating with carefully for a long period of time, they made recommendations for changing in the law. And those recommendations were then taken to the Irish people and passed in referendum at a higher percentage than they came out of the citizen assembly. And this has become a regular part of Irish self-government, that the people are called upon to be involved in making important decisions. And I think importantly, decisions that we have reasons to believe ordinary democracy is not going to be able to address. And so Ireland has done it. France has done it. A decade ago, a member of the French Parliament, a socialist member, proposed the idea. Every single party in the French Parliament signed a petition saying that a citizen assembly would be a violation of the core ideas of representative democracy. Now in France, people running for president make promises about the citizen assembly they will run. So Macron made a promise to run a citizen assembly about climate change, and for 9 months, every month, a random selection of French people came to Paris and they would meet and discuss these ideas of climate change. The next one was about end of life. And they continue to make this a central part of their democracy. Now, my point is not that we should ever imagine, or at least in our lifetime, that representative democracy will be replaced with these assemblies. Because representative democracy is more difficult than just getting agreement or understanding about a particular issue. But I do think that there are ways that if we can bring representative democracy and these more representative ways of representing us together, we could begin to push our representative democracy to be more sensible and to address issues which are really important and fundamental to Americans, even if they don't turn out to pay for the political parties that are trying to teach us to hate each other. And I think there are important issues we could raise in America, especially about amending our Constitution to address the problems of political reform that we have, most importantly, money in politics, that would unite citizens in the kind of citizen assembly environment and could begin to teach us that we are able, when we are structured and informed, to come up with democratic deliberations that are sensible and deserving of the respect of any democracy. We could believe, in this sense, in ourselves again. Now, I said that this was something that was only going to happen in the long term. And certainly there's a lot we have to get through before we get to something like that. I'm convinced we need to move to something like that, but it's not like something like that is going to solve the problem we face right now. And here's then what I think we need to do right now. And this is what makes me optimistic right now. Obviously, President Trump came to office in large part because he tapped into a populist fury that spreads across the United States. And the thing about populism is it's not left versus right. It's inside versus outside. And the thing that Donald Trump was able to tap into was a deep frustration that many Americans have with their government, a frustration that they don't believe their government is serving them, or they believe their government is corrupted, or they believe that no matter what the government promises, it's never going to be able to deliver it for ordinary Americans. And Donald Trump convinced America, whether rightly or wrongly, convinced America that he was going to make that government responsive to Americans. Now, that fact that he was able to succeed like that, to tap into that really important passion of this populism, I think is actually pretty hopeful, because I think all of us should agree that we need to fundamentally reform our government to make it more efficient in serving the public, to make it more efficient in delivering the services we know it must deliver, so that we can get more for the taxes we're paying. That's what efficiency means. More for the same or more for less. But the reality is right now we're seeing actions in the name of this populist movement that are not directed at making the government work better. They're actions aimed at shrinking the cost of government and making it, in fact, work worse. You don't walk into the DMV and recognize how inefficient the DMV is and think to yourself, oh, I know, we'll fix this by cutting in half the number of employees in the DMV. That's not efficiency. That's just about shrinking and reducing the cost of government. And of course, everybody recognizes the burdens of this incredible deficit that America faces right now. But a more direct way to face a deficit is not to radically cut the taxes, which the richest in America are going to pay. But that's the strategy of the administration right now, which says that it is acting in the name of the people to make government more responsive to them. I think this is a moment, an opportunity to agree with the argument, with the passionate claim that our government doesn't work, but to turn it around and to say, yes, our government doesn't work, and we can make it work. And we can make it work by working to make it work for ordinary Americans, not billionaires. Because this election is the most extreme billionaire election we have ever seen. The idea that one man, Elon Musk, can spend $277 million to elect a man president and then become the proto-president, standing next to him at every important meeting and directing government policy as his proto-president, and running a department that is radically changing what our government can do, just so happens in ways that personally benefit him, is the most clear example I think we've seen of the corrupting influence of money inside of politics. And indeed, just today, Pew released a study asking Americans what the most important issue they saw is, and the number one issue, 72% of Americans say the number one issue they care about is the corrupting influence of money in politics. Well, that's our movement. That's the movement that many of us have been fighting for the past, in my life, 18 years, but others for much longer than that. And this is the moment where we can tap into that movement and say, let's take this corruption out of our government and let's make our government work for all of us, and do that not by the traditional politician promising all the things the traditional politician will promise, but by exactly the way Trump has, speaking to people directly about their frustration about this government we have right now. I think that if we do that in a disciplined way, in a credible way, in a way constantly focused on how government can make people's lives better, how we can make it trustworthy, how we can end the perception that it is deeply corrupt or inept, if we could do that, we can take the frustration that produced this last election and spin it around in a way that is the most hopeful moment for reform. And reform along the way to getting us to a place where we are not so vulnerable from the influence of this infrastructure of media that surround us all around. Now, I'm sitting in my room, in my office at home. I don't really see anybody else, so maybe there's nobody else out there, but I'm happy to pause there and take whatever questions or feedback or reactions, I'm eager to hear, Jenny.
Great. So we did have one question pop up that I can respond to, and it is that yes, our presentation is recorded and a video will be available on the website within the next week. So please go to the NFRPP website to find that. So let's go back to citizen assemblies. How do the understandings that come out of citizen assemblies get communicated to the population at large?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge in a country our size is that you can have these citizen assemblies, but they always seem to be so small compared to the country. In a country like Ireland or France, when you have a national citizen assembly, the whole nation's paying attention to it. And that's very hard for us to replicate. And so I think in the American context, what we need to do is to multiply the number of them that are thinking about issues that are important to people and begin to convince people that, in fact, this way of representing us is the best way of representing us, that what comes out of a citizen assembly feels like magic. I wouldn't have said that if I hadn't experienced it directly. And not just in America. I have been involved and watched this process all around the world. And what people who are involved in these events say is that this is something unlike anything they've ever experienced when doing democratic work, because for the first time, they have confidence in the ability of Americans to, or ability of anybody, to work through problems in a common way. And that points to one of the things I'm most worried about in American democracy right now. Pew has done a study since 1998 where they ask Americans whether the Americans are confident about their Americans' political judgment. So are we confident that America can make sensible political judgments? In 1998, 2/3 of Americans said they were. 2/3 said they were confident that Americans could make good political judgments. Today, 2/3 are not confident. Only 1/3 has confidence in Americans' political judgment. And that's because we're surrounded by so much crazy that we can't help but believe, wow, we must just be crazy. And I think we have to address this loss of faith in ourselves by demonstrating to each other that we can do this. And so we need to find topics locally relevant that then people want to follow and can follow. And I think we could actually link these to the process of trying to amend our Constitution in a way that would capture the imagination of many Americans and get more attention to it. But I agree with the thrust of the question. This is the hardest part of the project I'm describing.
Are there any forms of citizen assemblies in the US that you know of today?
There have been a bunch recently. There's one in Bend, Oregon, and there have been a number that are being developed right now at the city level. We don't yet have any great statewide examples, although there's something that's very similar to this, run by Jim Fishkin out of Stanford, which he calls deliberative polling. They've done some pretty extraordinary national deliberative polls about lots of important issues. They did this one project called America in One Room, leading up to this election and the last election. And they would bring people together, give them briefing materials, which was developed in a fair way, so both sides of any issue believed that the material was fair. And then they would have people deliberate. And what you would see in the deliberations is that people's views would change by 20, 30 points. So you would start, and after the end of the deliberation, the numbers had changed by 20 or 30 points. Now, anybody who does polling knows that's an impossible amount of shifting for ordinary, political advertising or political engagement. But it's because people are good at listening and understanding when they're dealing with each other kind of in human speed, at human scale, that they begin to build understanding. And that understanding has a profound effect on how people understand what's going on and come to an agreement about it. Jenny, you're muted.
Sorry. How do you start a citizens assembly? How would we get those started
So there are a
across
number
the country?
of great organizations, and I'm happy to provide a list of this if you want to circulate it with the material. that are trying to work with local communities or organizations that are trying to run citizen assemblies. Democracy Next is an organization that is actually founded from Europe, but is doing a lot of work in the United States right now to develop the infrastructure to support citizen assemblies. FIDE is an organization that's trying to train people to be able to tee up and to run these citizen assemblies. I've been part of a project that's trying to get what we call a lever grant, which will be a very large grant to seed infrastructure in governments or in municipalities across the country to stand these up and make them work. Now we have a little bit of a debate going on inside of the community about what they should be. We tried to talk to people in Boston about setting up a citizen assembly, and the people in the government, had ideas like, well, why don't we have a citizen assembly to discuss like parking rates? And I feel like if people participated in a citizen assembly like that, they would think, isn't that what we pay you for? Like, why are we wasting our time to make a decision about like just a normal kind of governmental decision? As distinct from issues like in Ireland about same-sex marriage or abortion, or in America, issues about money in politics, because those are issues which we know the government can't solve by itself. I mean, as much as politicians talk about, the need to limit terms in Congress, they don't do anything about it. Much as they talk about deficits, they don't do anything about it. They can't do anything about it. Much as they talk about like the corrupting influence of money, we have yet to see Congress propose an amendment to the Constitution to address this issue in a serious way. And so I think that what we can recognize is some of these issues are the sort of issues government can't solve on its own. And that's why we have a role. That's what the role of us should be, to help them be able to decide those issues. And what I get excited about are recognizing issues which are incredibly important but unite us. So in Maine, I worked with people in Maine to tee up an initiative that was on the 2024 ballot that would end super PACs in Maine. And many people were skeptical about the initiative because they think that super PACs have been blessed by the Supreme Court. But in fact, the Supreme Court has never addressed the question of super PACs. People think Citizens United did that. It didn't have anything to do with super PACs. Super PACs were created by a lower court case that has just never been taken up to the Supreme Court. And so we've been working for many years to try to get this issue to the Supreme Court. And now we've passed an initiative in Maine that will tee this issue up. It's already been challenged. And my organization, Equal Citizens, along with a really fantastic state senator, a Republican state senator in Maine, Rick Bennett, and the people who ran the initiative, Cara and Peter McCormick, are now interveners in the case to try to defend that initiative. Now, that initiative passed in Maine with 74.9% of the vote. So Maine is a deeply purple state. What that means is Republicans and independents and Democrats alike overwhelmingly supported that initiative because all of us are deeply frustrated by the corrupting influence of money in politics. I, on Election Day 2023, went to Maine to help gather signatures to get that initiative on the ballot. I was in a little town called Hollis, Maine, and I was scheduled to be there for 13 hours gathering signatures. I'd never done anything for 13 hours in my life. But very quickly into the gathering in the morning, this guy came over to me and introduced himself, and he was the Donald Trump chairman for that county, and he was gathering signatures to get Donald Trump on the primary ballot. And he said, "Let me read the initiative." And I gave it to him, and he said, "Hell yeah!" And he signed it, and he said, "I'm going to get every one of my signatories to come over and sign your initiative too." And for the time he was there, that's exactly what he did, because this is not an issue that divides us. And so I think having these ways of engaging that demonstrate that on incredibly important issues, we actually do agree, gives us hope that there's a way for us to push through and address some of the issues that also would divide us.
Okay, I want to step away from citizens' assemblies just for a minute. There are a lot of questions here, but I think we're answering them in the course of your discussion. Here's a question. It says, I'm writing about your lecture for a class on power and political participation. How would you describe the process of growth in insulation between government officials and average Americans, and why concerted attacks on education are correlated?
Well, the relationship we have right now is a relationship between a public that has been manipulated into these buckets of understanding that social media and regular media produces. Like, regular media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, is no better. It's just not as efficient as social media in putting us into our buckets and focusing us in our divided ways. So the public is divided in this way, and the representatives need to engage with us in a way that helps them get elected. And so how do they engage with us? Through the same destructive, polarizing media. So we look at politicians today and ask, which ones are we most likely to see on our news feeds? The craziest, the people who are most extreme, the people who are willing to be the most extreme in what they say and what they do, because that's what social media rewards. So the point is, we're getting exactly what the incentives of the system reward, which is the most extreme and the most polarizing of politicians. And so when you think about, it's a great question, when you think about the relationship between government and the people, we don't really see that relationship. What we see is this relationship between those that are trying to scream at us to get our attention, and a public which is increasingly frustrated by the division and the destructive influence that's produced there. So I think a distinct question, and one very important to me, is the challenge that we're facing as the government tries to tell us what education can be. The Department of Education, supposed to be disappearing, but maybe it's one of its last acts, has issued a letter to universities that basically forbid universities from any DEI-related program. Now, DEI-related program could mean just affirmative action programs, and the Supreme Court has decided that affirmative action programs are no longer legal under Title VI of the United States Code, and for public institutions under the 14th Amendment. But it's not just affirmative action programs they're talking about. In this letter, they're basically prohibiting universities from having any program that has any connection to trying to assure that there's a more diverse group of people or members of the university. So if you have a program targeting poor districts in your state, that's suspect under the analysis of this letter, because why are you trying to get more poor people to come to your university? It must be because you're being motivated by race. Or even academic classes that talk about issues of race or issues of discrimination or the history of discrimination. These too are suspect. And what we have is a government threatening to withdraw support for educational institutions that talk about our past, because here's the reality: our past is filled with discrimination and injustice. And if we don't have an ability to talk about that freely, we don't have America anymore. And so I think the threat to the education that we're seeing right now is a profound threat. And we have to have the courage to stand up and resist it on principled grounds. Nobody says you have to agree with what I say or what somebody else says. But the idea that the government gets to control what I can teach is outrageous in a free society. And yet that's the claim that the government has made through the course of this letter that's being distributed to all universities in America right now.
Citizen assemblies keeps popping up in the questions. I think it's sparked a lot. So let me go back there. Could citizens assemblies be used to provide neutral information about all candidates running for a particular office?
It's a great idea. Oregon actually had something close to this. They have a initiative system, and as anybody who's I don't know if New Jersey has an initiative system. When I lived in California, there's initiatives in California, and you would get a book that's like 250 pages long every election, and the initiatives could be like 30 pages. Like, it's unbelievably complicated. And so you would go and you would vote and you wouldn't know anything about what you were voting about. So Oregon set up a system where they would have citizen assembly that would help translate what the initiatives were about and help people understand the pros and cons to the initiative, but in terms, in a language that people could understand. And that's been enormously valuable in helping people understand and make more sensible judgments about those initiatives. Now, in other countries, like in Greece, for example, in certain areas around, I think it's around Athens, they did this. They've run citizen assemblies to basically help select candidates who would then run against each other in elections. And so you would have a random representative group of people who would listen to all the candidates present, and then they would say, well, here's the candidates we think that makes most sense to present to the public. Indeed, in this last election, a bunch of us tried to get citizen assembly in the middle of the process the Democrats were going through to decide who was going to replace Joe Biden. Very quickly, obviously, Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee, but there was a period of time where people were talking about, should we have like a primary, a mini primary? And what we said is, well, what if we had an event where we brought together 2,000 Americans, random representative Americans, put them into a convention center-like place and had candidates like present over the course of the day, and people would break out into small groups and they deliberate about it. And we could even do a virtual deliberation where anybody could participate at the same time, watching the same material, and then watch how people's views evolve over the course of the day and see that, if you see that a certain candidate goes from being supported at 5% to being supported at 55%, it's a pretty big signal that that person is the sort of person who's going to be able to persuade a large number of people to support him or her. So we had teed up this idea, but obviously the campaign didn't go in that direction. I think we need to experiment with these things. I wouldn't offer them as something to replace the primaries we have right now, but I do think we should offer them as something that should compete with demonstrating the success of the process of selecting people with the primaries right now. And I think if we had this, people would increasingly look at it and say, wow, this is actually better than what we do in regular politics. And maybe we should listen more to this as a way to understand what candidates there should be or what policies our government should pursue.
One of our viewers asks if equal citizen sounds a lot like represent us. Is it? If not, what's the difference? Do you know Represent Us?
I know them very well, and I was a big supporter when they launched, and their work around corruption is very important. But that's a different organization. And the real difference right now is the focus on money in politics. In the last election, they were doing a lot of work around ranked choice voting and primary reform, and I think those reforms are important as well. But I'm convinced this is the root issue. Henry David Thoreau used to say, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root. Where we're striking at the root. And I think the focus on driving reform around money in politics is critical. Now, not equal citizens, but I'm working with many organizations that are also trying to spread the capacity to engage in these kind of citizen assemblies, or even just in deliberation. We had an organization working with a group called The People. Katie Fahey, who was a hero in Michigan getting gerrymandering reform, was behind that. And what this organization did, called deliberations.us, is it teed up virtual deliberations on a video platform around important democratic issues. So, for example, the Electoral College. And so that deliberation would ask people, about national popular vote and ranked choice voting, but it also asked them about an idea most people don't know about, which is to say, let's allocate electors in each state proportionally. at a fractional level. So if you get 54% of the vote, you get exactly 54% of the electors. And through the course of a deliberation, what we would see about those issues is that, people were pretty settled on the national popular vote issue. They weren't changing much because of deliberation. But when they deliberated about this fractional proportional vote, they went from skeptical to overwhelmingly supporting it. And so the very act of talking through it helped people see what would make sense. And so that group, and related to a project at Harvard that we have called Frankly, which is making this video platform available as cheaply as we possibly can to anybody to use to run deliberations. We're trying to make deliberations a central part of how people come to experience each other, whether it's politically or not. And those could also support the project of citizen assemblies.
So you have a citizens' assembly. Is the output of the citizens' assembly binding on politicians? And how would politicians go along with such a recommendation if it's not something that they're required to go along with? So
Yes.
if something comes out of a citizens' assembly, does a politician have to embrace it?
Yeah, so across the country, across the world, there are very different answers to that question. And in my own view is we shouldn't start it in a way that absolutely bans anybody. We should start it and run it and convince people it makes sense. And then once people are confident about it, then we can make it binding in certain ways. So here's like my favorite example that I'm working with others to try to build in the United States right now. I think most of us recognize our Constitution needs reform. I love our traditions and I love the idealism in our Constitution, but it's a flawed document in a lot of ways. And the most important, the most pressing, in my view, is the corruption that it permits through the way we fund campaigns. But whether you think it's that or term limits or the balanced budget, there's big movements out there to try to get reform in our Constitution. And what we know is Congress is never going to propose an amendment to address any of these issues, period. It's just not going to happen. So there's another way that the Constitution has for amending the Constitution, and that's through something called an Article 5 convention. And it's a convention, as the Constitution says, for the purpose of proposing amendments. So all it does is make a proposal, and then that proposal only becomes valid if 38 states ratify it. So it's just a proposal that is available for the states to ratify. And so there's a lot of people pushing to try to get Article 5 conventions to address questions like money in politics or balanced budget or term limits or any of the other issues that are at the constitutional level. Most people on my side of the political aisle, at least, are terrified about an Article 5 convention. I think that there's no basis for that fear, but I get it. People are terrified about it. So we've been talking about a couple stages on this road. So the first stage would be to imagine people running citizen assemblies inside the states. So imagine the state of Maine said, we would call a citizen assembly in Maine to address the question of whether there should be an amendment to address the problem of money in politics. And that citizen assembly would be convened and it would deliberate about it and it would give its views at the beginning and give its views at the end. And then those views would be made public. And then maybe it would do a couple more of those citizen assemblies. And at a certain point, if what the assemblies were doing seemed sensible, then the Maine legislature could say, okay, we now pass a law that says no delegate to an Article 5 convention from the state of Maine may support any amendment that has not gotten the support of at least, let's say, 60% of a Maine citizen assembly. So now what you've done is you've basically constrained the delegates at an Article 5 convention to only approve amendments that have been approved by a supermajority of a citizen assembly. So it's not deciding which amendments are part of the Constitution, but it's filtering to make sure only amendments that are supported by this deeply democratic and representative process would be available to be approved by the Constitution. Okay, but then you say, well, that's just a couple states doing that. What is that going to matter? Well, imagine 13 states. Remember, 38 are needed to pass any amendment. So imagine 13 states say, we hereby preemptively reject any amendment coming out of an Article 5 convention that is not itself democratically accountable. And now what you've done is you've used the power of the veto to basically force the convention to either be democratically accountable through citizen assemblies or referenda or whatever you want, or their work would be stillborn. Like immediately after an amendment is proposed, it's recognized as rejected because 13 states have rejected it. So the point is, if we could begin to build confidence in the process, I think we could get to a place where we've built essentially a new way to amend the Constitution, conventions which are constrained by citizen assemblies. And I mean legally constrained. They are legally bound to follow the rules of the convention and can be made enforceable against to follow those rules of the convention, which would be a much richer and more democratically representative way to address the problems of our Constitution than anything we've got right now.
Okay, this is a good question. If the assemblies become too powerful and persuasive, won't moneyed interest infiltrate those too?
It's a great question. And so that points to the need to protect them. So one way you protect them is, they're random representatives. So the people aren't running for the office of being in the assembly. So there's no money they're taking to run their campaigns. They're random and representative and pull together and do their work and deliberate. And you might decide, just like with a jury, you might decide to sequester them during the period where they're doing their deliberation, when they're doing their work, so that it could be done in a really, I think, powerfully inspirational way that you need to make sure that anybody can afford to participate. So you need to make sure you're covering whatever cost it's going to be for them to move and participate. I think we need laws to make it so that you can leave your job and your job has to be there. Like the government can pay for your wages, but the point is you can't lose your wages to participate in this. And we have to make it so anybody can really easily participate. But if we did that and we protected them, then yeah, people would try to manipulate them, and just like they try to manipulate juries. And it's not guaranteed it will be perfect, but I can guarantee it would be 1,000 times better than anything else we have right now. I mean, the point is, like, think about the way representative, like, legislatures work. I mean, those people, many of them, I have enormous respect for them. They go into government, they're trying to do the right thing, but they're constantly focused on the money. Members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money, calling people, begging for money, learning to be sycophants so that they can inspire the money they need. Now, nobody can look at that process and say that that process is a representative process. When they vote, they're thinking just about what the American people care about. No, they're thinking about what the funders are caring about. In the Republican Party right now, they're thinking about, is Elon Musk going to run an opponent to me? And what do I have to do to keep Elon Musk happy? That process is a deeply, deeply flawed process. So I would take any citizen assembly process, even an imperfectly protected citizen assembly process, and put it above these alternatives right now, because I have more faith in ordinary Americans thinking about issues in a serious way than I do have faith right now in most of the representative systems that we have.
We've had a couple of viewers ask for a list of the organizations you've referenced in your talk tonight. Would you be willing to share that we'll then send? We'll make it available on our website for everybody to access. That would be great if you can send that when we're through. To what extent does Citizens United contribute to the problem of money in politics in the form of super PACs, etc.? Why is this not talked about much anymore? We've talked about it a little bit tonight, but.
Yeah, well, I can tell you it's 90% of my life right now, because we are in the process of briefing the litigation to defend this initiative in Maine, which will take down super PACs. And the critical thing to see is Citizens United was about spending, not about contributions to committees. And what the Supreme Court said is, if you spend money independently of a campaign, there's no legitimate interest for the government to restrict that spending because, as the court said, the only justification for restricting spending is the risk of what they say quid pro quo corruption, this for that corruption. And so if the spending is independent, there's no risk of quid pro quo, or another way to put it is, if there is a quid pro quo between the spender and the candidate, then it's not independent. So that was the logic of Citizens United. And you can accept it or reject it, but that logic means you can't limit the amount somebody spends. But a contribution to a committee that's going to spend that money is a totally different question. There was a lower court case 3 months after Citizens United in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals called Speech Now versus FEC. And in that case, the court said, well, if you can't limit the spending because there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption, you can't limit contributions because there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption with the contribution either. And that is an obvious mistake. And the best evidence of its error happened 5 years after that, when Robert Menendez, a name familiar to many people in New Jersey, was indicted. And the indictment was that he engaged in a bribe with a Florida businessman, a quid pro quo with a Florida businessman. And the exchange was Robert Menendez was supposed to do favors, get government favors for that businessman. And the businessman was supposed to contribute to Robert Menendez's super PAC. So there was quid pro quo involving a contribution to a super PAC, the very thing that the DC Circuit said was impossible. Indeed, Menendez's lawyers had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss the indictment, saying the thing you've accused us of, the DC Circuit said, could not happen. But of course, it did happen. So they didn't dismiss the indictment. He was not convicted in that trial. It was a later trial he was convicted. But the point is, it shows the mistake that was in the core of the opinion that created super PACs. And we've just not had a chance, despite many efforts by many different groups, to get this question up to the Supreme Court. So I think Citizens United, I would have decided Citizens United differently. But the point is, even without overturning Citizens United, applying existing Supreme Court doctrine, the Supreme Court should say that super PACs can be limited, even if you can't limit spending by independent political action committees. And that would be an enormous victory. It would be a radical change from the corruption that we see right now, even if it wouldn't be perfection. There would still be problems, but it would be 70, maybe 80% of the problem solved simply by the court applying its existing principle in a correct way. And that's what we're fighting to do right now. And that you can learn about at our website, Equal Citizens, and join the list, and we'll keep you updated about every single step along the way. We're in the district court. It will then go to the First Circuit, regardless of how the district court decides. The great thing about the First Circuit is it's never decided this question. So we have a clear, clean slate. And if they get it right, we will be in the Supreme Court. And I'm confident this Supreme Court, even this Supreme Court, is going to get this one right.
I want to go back to earlier conversation about social media. And just to paraphrase some of the questions we've gotten here, social media is so embedded in our lives now. How do we, and you described the behavior earlier as not necessarily a constructive behavior to our lives. How do we remove it? I mean, short of turning it off. But one person referenced earlier that you can often get breaking news faster in social media than you can get in your local news. So if we're so addicted to that need for news and the need for information, combined with the sense that we're catching up with our dearest friends who we haven't seen in 20 years, but we're really not because we're just looking at them on a screen, how do we get it out and change the behavior?
Yeah, it's extremely hard. And the thing to recognize is it's not passive. So if you start disengaging, the AI behind the social media notices, and it figures out what it needs to do to get you back, to pull you back. Like you'll get an email that sort of says something that triggers you to come back. So it's smart. It's incredibly smart. It's much smarter than any human can be to figure out how to manipulate you to get you back. Think about TikTok. When TikTok was born, the people who founded TikTok came to the Jason Peretti, who runs BuzzFeed, describes meeting the person who started TikTok. And he was looking for what he was describing as tens of thousands of videos every day. It didn't matter what the videos were. Didn't matter at all. Because he had AI that was going to figure out, based on how people reacted to the videos, exactly which videos needed to be served to them. And almost immediately figure out like what the thing would be that would keep them addicted. And the point is that AI is really incredibly good at it. And so I think, we've got to be really proactive, just the same way that many people are really proactive about what they eat. Look, processed, ultra-processed food, fast food nation. We all recognize how unhealthy that is for Americans. You look around at America, those of us my age, remember a time when America didn't look like this. You didn't walk around recognizing everybody was like wildly unhealthy or overweight. And the difference is not that we're lazy. It's not like we were running 10 miles 50 years ago. It's that we have a wildly different diet, and that diet is wildly unhealthy. And so people who recognize that, it's very difficult to get off of that diet. It's very difficult to have a different way of living. But people do it, and I think it's the same kind of response we need to make to social media. So on my phone, there's a great little technology called Brick, BRICK, and it's looks like a little brick. It's a gray brick, and you put your phone against it, and it will disable your social media. And then the only way to re-enable it is to put your phone against that brick again. Well, I in the morning will disable my social media. I'll take my phone, I'll go to work, and then I come home. And the plan was that, late at night, before I go to bed, I turn it on and check in. And actually, most nights, I just don't check in anymore. I just don't want to. I mean, the New York Times is still available, and Google News, I look at that. But I don't go on Reddit, or I don't go on any of the other social media things. I could, but I don't. And the point is just these tiny little inhibitions that are really real, I think can begin to help people break the habit. So, the reality is you don't need to check the news every hour. You just don't need to. Once a day is really is good. Even once a day reading a newspaper, that would be really enough. I mean, there might be emergencies. And of course, if there's an emergency, it's great to be able to get input. We used to be able to rely on Twitter. I don't know anybody who would rely on X anymore for honest reporting of what's going on. But, I'm not saying we should destroy the network, but we need to liberate ourselves from these technologies because they are just destroying our collective ability to make decisions in a way that is supporting our democracy. And when you think about it like that, when you think it's not because, I'm not saying that there aren't foreign enemies who are trying to destroy us. We don't have to get there. I'm not saying it's not because Mark Zuckerberg really is just trying to destroy America. But when you think that this is just a business model, if you told me that we had to sacrifice democracy to end climate change, I wouldn't agree with you, but I would understand that. I would understand the point. Or if you said we had to sacrifice democracy to end world hunger, I wouldn't agree with you, but at least I would understand what you're talking about. The idea that we're sacrificing democracy so that these tech billionaires can get even richer is just literally unimaginable. Why are we doing that? But that's what we're doing because we're allowing these technologies to take over our democracy, our lives, without any pushback, any regulatory pushback in America. And that, I think, is disastrous. So because we don't have a government doing anything, we've got to do something. And there are things we can do. I'm just not optimistic that enough of us will do it quickly enough.
Well, maybe if we keep comparing it to processed foods, that'll help. One last question on citizens' assemblies. How is this different than a caucus?
Right. So the important difference is that the people who are there are random and representative, or for pollsters, you just say a stratified population. But what that means is you decide what demographics are important. So, obviously sex is important, race would be important. Depending on the jurisdiction, it might be wealth is important, but whatever ones are important. So you say there's got to be X% men and X% women, X% Democrats, X% Republicans, just to reflect the demographics of the population. And then you randomly select people to fill in those buckets so that you know that you have not the people who are going to come down to the town hall and scream at a town meeting, not just those people, but every selections from every person, just the same way that Gallup conducts a poll. Like Gallup conducts a poll in the same way. They make random calls and they fit them into a representative map of what the population is, and that's the representation of the population. That's different from a caucus, because typically a caucus is filled with people who are the most motivated to participate. Now, I'm not against people who are the most motivated to participate, but what we know is that those people tend to be the most extreme in any party. So one of the problems we have with primaries right now in America is that very few people participate. But the people who do participate are the most extreme in the party, whether it's in the Democratic Party on the left or the Republican Party on the right. And so what that means is that candidates are extremely sensitive to the extreme part of their own party, which means that the vast majority who are not in those extremes aren't effectively represented. Now, the people who participate might say, well, if you don't like this, show up. But what we know is people won't, in general, in a fair and representative way, show up. So the objective of the Citizen Assembly is to try to get a mix that is really representative of all of us. And that will include the 5% of us that's crazy, no doubt. But the 95% of us who's not will also be represented and have their voice heard too.
Okay, thank you. I think we've pretty much covered almost all of the questions. And I really hope you'll share your list with us, because I think there's genuine interest in seeing that and learning more about what we've talked about tonight. Thank you for coming back to the Network for Responsible Public Policy and sharing your extensive knowledge and wisdom with the NFRPP audience. Your insights into the influence of money in politics, the health dangers clearly of, or health is probably the wrong way to say it, but it's stuck in my head, processed foods, danger of social media, have been invaluable. We are most appreciative of your time. And thank you to our partner, the McCourtney Institute at Penn State University. We encourage you to visit their website, democracy.psu.edu, sign up for their newsletter, and connect with their Democracy Works podcast series. Please join us on Thursday, March 27th, for a panel discussion that will answer the question, is the rule of law enough to protect democracy? Good night.